what role do you see civil engineers play in disaster recovery, and how can their work shape long-term resilience?
It's really been interesting. It's been, I think as engineers, a lot of times we get very focused on technical or, especially early parts of our career. In governments and societies and cultural cities, territories, in the case of the Virgin Islands where I've been working, a lot of those institutions that have been built up to serve various capacities in society end up being those silos.
Did you know that civil engineers are often the unsung heroes of disaster recovery? Their expertise not only helps rebuild communities, but ensures that this infrastructure is stronger, more resilient, and better prepared for future challenges. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Len Wright, Ph.D., P.E., D.WRE, subject matter expert at Witt O'Brien's, senior project manager at Sulzer Group, and founder of Blue Stream Innovations, LLC, to talk about the critical role civil engineers play in disaster recovery, the challenges of aligning recovery efforts with sustainable infrastructure, and the strategies that drive long-term resilience. I'm your host, James Taylor, and this is the Civil Engineering Podcast. It's now time for our Civil Engineering Conversation of the Week with Len Wright, Ph.D., P.E., D.WRE. Len, welcome to the Civil Engineering Podcast.
Thank you, James. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
So starting off, can you share a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to specialize in civil engineering, especially disaster recovery?
Yeah, I guess starting off, it was really, the love of the environment. I got into engineering through, not directly through civil engineering, but into a program called forest engineering as the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. It's a mouthful. And forest engineering is sort of a little known discipline, and it's kind of been transforming over the years, but it's kind of a blend of agricultural engineering, environmental, civil, and a little bit of mechanical. And it was really involved with the outdoors. Originally, it was set up for forest management and agriculture, or really silviculture, which is forest as a resource. And so I did a lot of water resources. I did, a lot of different things in that discipline, but it was an ABET accredited program. And as I moved on, I took some of those pieces and realized I was doing civil engineering. So I ended up getting a master's degree and then a PhD at the University of Colorado, where I got exposed to hazards and disasters. I had done a lot of modeling as part of my early career. And so I started applying that in a disaster context. So my first academic appointment at the University of Colorado was at the Natural Hazard Center. And so there was a multidisciplinary group that I was part of, NSF-sponsored research. And I really learned where civil engineering fit in. And so all the modeling I was doing, from, some of the early days, how that fit in a more cultural and societal and governmental context. And so that, fast forward 20 years was what brought me back into disaster recovery work and hurricane recovery. So there was a lot of technical elements, but also a lot of networking pieces of that puzzle.
So what role do you see civil engineers play in disaster recovery, and how can their work shape long-term resilience?
It's really been interesting. It's been, I think as engineers, a lot of times we get very focused on technical or, especially early parts of our career. Disasters break down silos, right? And in governments and societies and cultural cities, territories, in the case of the Virgin Islands where I've been working, a lot of those institutions that have been built up to serve various capacities in society end up being, those silos effectively get broken down when a disaster hits. And that presents a tremendous opportunity from a systems perspective to start looking at opportunities for resilience and building back stronger and better. So as a civil engineer, and I focus on water resources, drinking water, sewer, wastewater, and drainage infrastructure, stormwater. It allows, for example, in the cases of the recovery for Irma Maria in the Virgin Islands, it allowed us to start to look at how interconnected our infrastructure systems are with respect to transportation, power, water, sewer. And so there's an opportunity there to look at how the systems can be rebuilt in the context of, uncertain future with, climate change and things of that nature. So there's some real opportunities, and it's not just a design focus. It's really more of a planning approach.
Yeah. Earlier in January, we saw probably one of the worst forest fires in California. How do you see civil engineers kind of playing out related to that disaster specifically?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. So, to tie what I was just speaking about with hurricane recovery, some of that work that I was able to do was related to drainage infrastructure and got me into hydrology, back into hydrology and applied hydrology, hydraulics. And the company I was working for as a subject matter expert, Whit O'Brien's, has had some work in New Mexico with post-fire and flooding. And so I was brought in to address sort of the flooding piece of that. And that has led to some other work in some specific places in New Mexico, but particularly with respect to how the cascade of drought/aridification and changing climate, the new normal with fire, and then subsequent flood and flooding, on a post-wildfire watershed. And so, sediment movement is a big deal. And so now and that's where I'm actually currently sitting, is in Las Vegas, New Mexico, looking at some of these impacts and working with scientists, engineers, a team of subject matter experts to evaluate how we can build back. Now looking to California in the fires, you can really see, there's going to be an opportunity there to address, what that post-wildfire or post-fire, flooding will look like, systems will look like, what, how we can maybe address some of the lessons learned in these other Western states and fires. For example, the fire in Glenwood, the Grizzly fire there in 2021. Things of that nature will really become apparent, I think, in the California fires, particularly with how the watersheds have changed and their response to precipitation and flooding.
You mentioned a little bit, but how can nurturing a professional network outside your immediate discipline impact civil engineers' career and the work that they do?
Oh yeah, that's become a big part of, how my career trajectory has gone, because I did start, pretty focused on modeling urban systems and combined sewer overflows in the Northeast, and a very technical approach to simulating solutions. And as I moved on to graduate school at the University of Colorado and became exposed to that multidisciplinary environment, particularly with the Natural Hazard Center there in Boulder, it helped me as I progressed, because opportunities that arose were outside of, I'd say, traditional engineering. And I was for sure focused on sort of an applied research areas. So I did some work, in a variety of contexts where I was the water resources engineer. I wasn't working with a team of engineers. I was working with anthropologists and geographers and economists. And I did, opportunity to do some work consulting for the World Bank in Africa. And I was the same approach, where it was this multidisciplinary team where I was bringing engineering knowledge and solutions into a much broader perspective of problem solving. And so one of the more interesting, I guess, diversions or where my career path took, I was serving as a water resources engineer and manager at a utility in Colorado, when out of the blue, I got a message from an old friend that I hadn't heard from for 20 plus years on LinkedIn. And he was one of the, fellow students from the Natural Hazard Center. And he said, "Hey, I'm down in the Virgin Islands and we need someone who does wastewater." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds interesting." And, there was a whole story about how that evolved, but ultimately he was an anthropologist and they were just looking for someone who could, address some of the problems in the recovery effort that were water related, wastewater related, drainage related. And so I fit the bill. And that's really how this whole journey started at that point with respect to hurricane recovery and then fire and flood. It was all sort of water resources related, but it its root really was because I sat in a multidisciplinary research project in the office back in my PhD program, and I worked with this anthropologist, and he was writing mitigation proposals for the recovery efforts there.
Len, that was a great point about networking, and I'm guessing when you made that connection years ago, you probably never thought that person would ever come back into your life so many years later, and I think that kind of shows the importance of you never know what relationship or what interaction that you make years before will make an impact on your career years later.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that there's certainly mentors and senior advisors, of course, that become important and provide opportunities along the way. But also your peers, as you mature and grow
Yeah.
into your profession, they're out in the world as well. And if you make those positive connections earlier in your career, you never know what's going to bear fruit. Where that's going to come from. Yeah, I mean this guy was an office mate, friend in graduate school, but we just didn't keep up. We were in different parts of the country and different careers, but it was a social network, that really connected us too, which was kind of funny because he told me that story later, how he was, in a meeting where they're asking for connections, and
Hmm.
he remembered, oh yeah, that engineer that I sat next to back in Boulder, and there we are. So
You
yeah,
never
it
know
was
what
interesting.
what will
Yeah,
happen.
and I did the same thing. Really, I built a team uh, that were also, all connections that I made. Great GIS analysts that I sat with at one of the utilities I worked at, and some other connections through academia. And we built a nice team that could function within the recovery space, which is very different than a typical engineering consulting situation because you have there's resources available, FEMA and others that have rules and procedures and guidelines, and also a focus of objectives that maybe a traditional design approach wouldn't really be appropriate, but the planning perspective that I was lucky enough to kind of latch onto and enjoy really fit the bill. And so then finding the technical pieces of my network, to fit in where I can't cover all those bases, but I did sort of see the big picture with respect to what can we use, with what we have at hand to really help and maximize the recovery efforts within the Stafford Act and all the various, so I was lucky enough to work with policy experts,
Yeah.
which was great, to be able to just learn that whole world of federal policy and FEMA and the Stafford Act and many other things too with respect to EPA and some other agencies, but how, you know, we could tell a story with data and information to see here's how we're going to come back and build back better. And, the same approach here in the wildfires in New Mexico. And, I assume, I've been a little bit exposed with the fires in Maui and in California, I'm sure, as well as others. It's just, unfortunate, but it does present opportunities uh, if you have the right perspective and technical knowledge and network to
Mhm.
put all those pieces together.
Here with Len Wright, we're talking about civil engineering's roles and how they make an impact on disaster recovery. And Len, what role do civil engineers play in helping governments understand the requirements for managing the assets they build and operate?
Yeah, that's so critical because engineers have a perspective on life cycle performance and costs and benefits. And, the decision makers, policymakers, they're not necessarily going to have all that knowledge. So we need to be able to tell that story so that they, can understand and also reflect back to boards and the public stakeholders that, this buried in a lot of times the infrastructure is buried, right? A lot of the water resources work that I do is buried infrastructure, and that gets forgotten, as we know. And
Out of sight, out of
being
mind,
able,
right? You don't see
yeah,
it,
exactly.
you
Yeah,
use
it
it,
works.
but you don't really know. Yeah, oh, it's there. It's underneath the roadway, underneath the ground. Yeah.
Exactly. So you only notice it when it breaks, but it can be catastrophic failure. So being able to articulate and tell that story of what we're funding, what we're spending money on. These are, a lot of times it's public dollars. And we take that very seriously in terms of the investments that we're making as a society and to understand the performance that we're getting out of it. And the I'd say particularly, modeling tools and modern data, management tools have become a long way with being able to communicate. Ultimately, that's a big message here is the communication, the ability to communicate outside of a technical civil engineering conference. If I'm in a room of engineers and we're all water resources engineers and we could go, super nerdy and talk about, all kinds of things all day, but that doesn't really help the public understand anything. That
Right.
doesn't help the politicians who have to, allocate resources. And you have a lot of competing resources at municipal and regional levels. And how does water and wastewater and drainage fit in with respect to, everything else that's happening? And so that's a very important skill. And so if we take the funding pieces, the costing, sort of the traditional engineering, but then the benefits of what society gets out of it ultimately, through fire protection with a water system and, flood and what flood management means, going back to my, some of my earlier academic discussion with respect to, managing, not controlling nature was a big theme that came out of, my work with the Natural Hazard Center, founded by famous geographer Gilbert White, who I was lucky enough to, meet and work with a little bit towards the end of his career there, and really interesting perspective on, and it's sort of a different perspective from the geographer and social science perspective rather than, sort of the command and control that might arise out of a typical engineering education.
Len, you talked a little bit about, how you kind of built a team around you and kind of, got the people that the GIS people, the different aspects of a project and kind of built that team around you to be able to lead you to success. How can engineering managers implement technical team building in a way that incorporates empathy, understanding, and creative imagination?
Yeah, that was an interesting lesson for me, and probably before I got, back into the hazards field and recovery field, it was, working with teams and kind of learning on the job. I wasn't really trained as a manager, it's just something we pick up along the way of, the logical steps of our career. And it really became apparent that the team I was leading, I'm thinking of one in particular, a utility, had a lot of disparate functions within this team, and not everyone understood maybe when I started where they fit in. And so giving them giving the team perspective and then listening, saying, okay, here's our overall program. We're trying to accomplish these things with water rights and water supply and environmental impacts, et cetera. And you have a role in sustainability and you have a role in our GIS, asset management program. And, oh, here's, we're leading an O&M program for sewers. and then listening to them. What are your, getting our professionals engaged, like they have a meaningful part, and it's very easy to say, all right, do this, and I'll keep the
Yep.
grand scheme in my head. But let that grand scheme out, even if it's flawed, right? And get feedback and listen. And that's what I meant, when I was thinking of, you know, concepts is empathy. Like there's a person here, and they might have had some, you know, career paths that they weren't happy with, and they might, have sat through performance reviews where it's just, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. And I took a different approach, and I think it really helped because I said, okay, what's working from your perspective? What's not working from your perspective? How do you see? And all of a sudden, you could see their level of engagement changed when I started doing that, which is really,
It's
really
such an
interesting.
important part of it, right? Yeah, it's such an
That
important part of letting them see the big picture because so often I think, as engineers, we are very task oriented, right? We're very focused on here's what's going on, here's the pieces that we need to get there. And if we don't let others know about what our vision or what our goal is associated with that project or whatever it might be, they think that I'm just doing a task. They don't see how their little piece of the puzzle fits into everything else that we're doing on. And like you said, you pull them in, you get a different perspective, you get a different understanding. They become more engaged when they understand that, hey, without my piece, we can't complete this.
right.
And I think that's really important to understand as civil engineers.
It really is. And it helped me too, because I think I had that same experience where, both on both sides of that, where I was given tasks that I didn't really understand why. And it was just this endless spreadsheet, and, it was never going to end, versus, a leader who would, paint the big picture, maybe without all the detail, but say, oh, I fit in here. This is really cool now because this data that I'm, trying to tell a story with is really going to, be a critical piece of this. And so that really was an interesting learning experience for me, for sure.
You talked about EPA, you talked about FEMA. Those are some programs that are out there that also provide some funding sources, right? And so
Yeah.
what are some key aspects engineers need to understand about capital project funding sources?
Yeah, that's just been, well, particularly in the recovery space, disaster recovery space. I am lucky enough to work with some very talented specialists who understand, how those programs work, and then I'd sort of picked it up along the way. But helping, in the whatever our applicants slash clients, depending on, the context, which is the right, phrase to use, but typically for, in a FEMA recovery space, we're dealing with applicants and sub-applicants within the confines of various sections of the Stafford Act. And understanding what the goals of each of those programs are, because they were set up for very specific goals. Having experts be able to explain and sort of shepherd the process to the government agencies at the local and regional levels that we work with, or state and territory, has been really helpful. So there's a information flow from the technical through the policy, ultimately to the local and regional decision makers. And there's a local cost share, so it's not entirely federally funded. So to understand what that really means and what they're buying and what they're paying for and how it's going to improve when future conditions arise with, however they might, the programs are set up to improve things ultimately, and it's our, I feel, responsibility as engineers to be able to not just build back what was there previously, but to really help both integrate systems as well as, look and tell that story of future conditions and what, the future climate holds, and why, certain things are happening at the watershed level that are really going to impact our day-to-day life in terms of water availability, fire likelihood, and flood sediment a lot of cascading
Yeah.
impacts that we are part of that recovery puzzle.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, you brought up we're all thinking about, the fires, and fires is just the first part, right? You're talking about putting that out, getting that contained, but, okay, now you're talking about sediment, you're talking about flooding, you're talking about, erosion, all that stuff that comes into play, and, yeah, it's a huge part, that we need to kind of be looking at. You had mentioned earlier about, hey, we're a bunch of engineers in a room. We can geek out, we can nerd out, we can talk very high level, or sorry, really really go down into the details, but you have to relay that information to the decision makers, the policy makers in the right way. So how can civil engineers use the data, the process level content, the nerd aspects of engineering, pare it down to be able to tell a compelling story that really engages those decision makers?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think it's something I worked on. I had the opportunity to do some teaching along the way, adjunct faculty type, mostly modeling type courses for water resources engineers at the University of Colorado, and there's a few other opportunities as well. But telling that story in a teaching context started to get my head around how we can't just start off with the detail, right? And so it's sort of a storyboard it. And then certainly for a graduate class, you're going to dive into the detail stuff, but you have to have that top layer of, and that storyline concept. I had one manager, I remember, say, well, we got to cartoon this, just do it at a cartoon level. And if you can't draw it out as a cartoon, then you don't really understand it enough. And I think there's plenty of quotes. I think that, if you go back, I'm sure, we could come up with a list of things to that a lot of smart people before me have said, that to really understand it, you have to be able to explain it to, your 5-year-old.
Mhm.
And that's hard. I mean, that's
Yeah.
not always easy. But to get that skill or to hone that skill, for decision makers, and I'm not saying there are a lot of really smart people, but they're not going to be a geomorphologist who can understand why, sediment is moving now after a fire and it wasn't before. So the right level for the audience, and that's might be different, in different contexts, but that being able to zoom in and out of that detail is really helpful.
Having a 5-year-old myself right now, I'm hopefully getting a lot of experience with,
Yeah.
explaining things and boiling things down, with him as he continues to grow and ask me about what I do and, how his work. You really have to, like, pare it down because it is question after question, and if you don't answer it the right way or pare it down enough, it's definitely you just
Right.
keep getting more and more questions. It causes more confusion.
Right.
So hopefully that's something I'm learning right now.
That's great.
Len, we're getting close to wrapping up here, but a couple last things for you. What challenges do you see in aligning disaster recovery efforts with long-term infrastructure resilience?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. I mean, particularly where you have legacy infrastructure and sort of the, decisions that weren't necessarily they were good decisions at the time, but now we're sort of left with a legacy of systems and structures that now, from a sort of adaptive management perspective, how can we latch on to what our current state of knowledge is, and how might an engineer from 50 years down the road look back at the decisions I'm making and my team and our
Yeah.
decision, wow, they really got it right, or oh, what were they thinking, kind of thing. The
Yeah.
So some of the challenges from a systems perspective, in my field in water resources particularly, there's a lot of green infrastructure that's had a lot of success. How that interacts and interrelates with gray infrastructure from a performance standpoint is really interesting. And there's a lot of sort of cutting edge science that we're implementing, from an engineering context in the gray green interfaces. And so that there's challenges and opportunities, right? I think that's really what we could come down to. And how much do we, build in a adaptive framework versus a very, sort of put a lot of concrete in the ground and hope it works. So I think there's a blend there, right? There's a blend, though. They're both needed. And I think that's sort of going back to some of my academic interests in optimization and decision support in a risk management framework. Those kind of performance measures, I think, present a real opportunity to build back better and stronger. I definitely am seeing that here in New Mexico. I'm currently, like I said, I'm sitting in Las Vegas, New Mexico, in San Miguel County, doing some subject matter expert work with a company called
Hmm.
Sulzer Group. And it's really interesting to see how, I'd say, a historic old town, which has a lot of beauty and interesting culture, has been hit by fire and floods, one after the other, and seeing what the opportunities are here for integrated approaches with water resources, for water supply. There's been issues with, post-fire sediment impacting drinking water supplies, both from a reservoir standpoint as well as treatment, really interesting aspects of runoff there, a lot of damaged transportation infrastructure. That presents some really interesting opportunities for the same thing, the gray and the green infrastructure, the soft approach. We have a watershed that's undergoing constant changes. I mean, the impacts of the fires here, will be felt, years down the road with respect to
Mhm.
sediment movement through the waterways and the intersection with the transportation networks, which are vital. And there's a lot of dirt roads, gravel roads here in rural New Mexico, and those get really impacted. So it's been very interesting, the challenges and opportunities, how we face those in the context of the funding sources and the future needs of the community ultimately.
So, Len, I waited till the very end of our discussion to bring this up, but one of the things that really spurred me into pursuing a career into civil engineering was Hurricane Katrina. I was in high school at the time, and that was something where, hey, that was seeing that impact, really kind of impacted me and said, hey, I really want to make a difference. Now, I didn't go into this disaster recovery, but the more and more you look at it, these are the things that are standing out there that are kind of pulling, can pull people into the industry. And I feel like there's not a ton of engineers that are like, hey, disaster recovery is really where I want to be. So what is final piece of advice you give to engineers looking to expand their impact in disaster recovery and infrastructure management?
Yeah, probably, early on, early mid-career, it probably takes a little bit of getting out of your comfort zone. Because, yeah, if you're in a room and you're the only engineer, that can have its, you know, benefits, but it also could be, wow, you engineers really messed things up here. So there's, you're
Take the blame for everyone else, right?
right. I've definitely been in that situation. But, yeah, a little bit out of your comfort zone, I think that's important to be able to, listen. And we do, have a engineering, you end up with a disciplined mindset to take the facts at hand and apply and look at risk and look at performance. And you have a very sort of cut and dry, right? Where you're in a room full, well, how is this going to work? And how's that going to work? And what happens here and there? And suddenly you're in a very dynamic environment of multiple objectives. Ultimately, that's really, and so from a disaster recovery standpoint, the room gets much bigger. You're not just designing a wastewater treatment plant to satisfy, the Clean Water Act and serve this city. I'm sorry. You're, looking at a much broader set of objectives, that include transportation, that include power, that include growth and land use and infill and land use change. And suddenly, your head explodes. So you have to say, okay, how are we going to, work together to solve these problems? And it's fascinating. I think the disaster recovery field, you're absolutely right, does would benefit from having more civil engineers that sort of specialize in that. both from a response and a recovery standpoint.
You said step out of your comfort zone. That's one of the biggest things. You can't be there sitting in, hey, I've learned this. This is where I'm at. I'm happy. You got to step outside that comfort zone and really begin to grow. Len, thanks so much for sharing about disaster recovery and the impact that you've made throughout the year. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, now it's time for our CE Hot Seat segment of the week with Len Wright. Len, welcome to the CE Hot Seat. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right, Len, do you have any specific rituals that you practice every day? For example, do you have a specific morning ritual or lunchtime ritual, things that you do daily that contribute to you being a successful professional?
Interesting question. I tend to be undisciplined in a lot of ways. I like improvisation and winging it a little too much, probably to my detriment. But I will say the one morning ritual that I learned about and caught on, and it does work. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's kind of become part of pop culture, but that swallow the frog first thing in the morning, which is, if there's something you really don't want to do, it's an email or an for me, it's always admin. I don't want to do admin tasks. Plan it the night before. Like, all right, I have to send out this email and I have to really think about how or whatever. I'm going to make this phone call. I have to prep for a meeting the night before, the end of the day, previous day. And then when you come in the morning, that's, the most disagreeable thing that you have on your itinerary for the day. Swallow the frog is that's the most, unpleasant thing you can think of. Get that done first. The rest of your day then feels a lot better. And it is true. You can get into deep focus work after you get the uncomfortable, kind of annoying or whatever you didn't want to do. It's done. And so then you actually can focus on some deep work and things that are more enjoyable. If you flip that, and is my probably natural tendency is to procrastinate the unpleasant, and then all day you're like, oh, I gotta do that. It's not going to be any fun. So,
What is one book that you recommend to engineers regularly, or just one book that you have found to be extremely helpful in your professional and or personal development?
interesting question. I can't say that there is a specific sort of engineering book that I frequently recommend, and I'd say a lot of my perspective is pretty broad with respect to the arts. I will say this, a book I'm currently reading is one I definitely have recommended, and I'm not through it all yet, and it's not engineering and it's not management, but it's really good with respect to how we think, and it's The Creative Act: A Way of Being. Rick Rubin's book. He's been, famous music producer, and fascinating book. It's not about music. It's about creativity and the creative mind. And that's something that's really been at the heart of what I strive for in engineering, which is, always looking to improve and not just do things the way we did it before. And so I'm really getting a lot out of this book. So I think I'm going to be recommending it more.
Love it. Thinking back on managers of the past, picture your favorite manager or managers. What made them your favorite?
Getting back to, they listened. Ultimately, they listened to me when I was very shy, very young engineer. My first manager, I didn't know I had anything, valuable to say. And he really took time to listen. And even, when I was making mistakes or doing things, favorably, that was it. What I like to have, and that I spun that around later in my career when I became the manager to remember that. But to listen, that is a very valuable management technique, I think, is to ask questions and then listen to the responses, and not always just being, conveying information from the top down.
I love it. I've got one final question, and that is the critical civil engineering career elevator advice question, which is a mouthful. But if you got into an elevator with a civil engineering student and had about 30 to 40 seconds with them, what career advice would you share with them?
Get in the field every chance you can. It's plain and simple. From a planning, modeling perspective, it's go out and collect data, be with the field teams, get on the watershed that you're studying. If you're a designer, look at what, other, previous attributes of failure and successes. Get in the field, get out, out of the office as much as you can, and ask questions. Those are the two things, really.
Len, thanks so much for joining us today. Where can our listeners connect with you?
Oh, geez. Yeah. Well, I'm on LinkedIn, is probably the easiest. And, I could put an email up. I have several emails. I don't know what's the best way, but probably LinkedIn is the easiest.
Well, Len, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate all you had to share, and best of luck as you continue with disaster recovery.
Thanks so much, James. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Please remember you can find the show notes for this episode at civilengineeringpodcast.com. There you'll find the summary of the key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources, websites, or books mentioned during the episode. Until next time, I wish you the best in all your civil engineering endeavors.